As you said, I have a background generally on gender and Islam in experiences and representations of refugee situations, and my research focuses in particular on protracted refugee situations in the Middle East and North Africa. And I've conducted research with and about Kurdish, Palestinian and Sahrawi refugees in particular, but given that we have other speakers discussing the situation of Palestinian refugees and of Kurdish refugees, I decided to focus on a slightly different lens, also following Catherine's invitation to reflect on the development or the potential development for a conversation between feminist activism and refugee strategies transnationally and refugee struggles transnationally. So that's really the lens that I'm going to be using. Within the broader context of my ongoing research, for example, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, which is looking at Palestinians' responses to refugees from Syria in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. So that's one of the main focuses of my ongoing research. But here I'm going to focus on the question of the relationship between feminist activism and refugee struggles through the lens of what I'm calling refugee feminism. To critically reflect on the notion of sisterhood and sorority, but also the assertion or the reproduction of hierarchies of worth and positional superiority, which often arise in contexts of Middle Eastern and North African refugee situations and experiences of these in the Middle East and also in the West. So I haven't quite developed a coherent definition of what refugee feminism might be or is. So this is partly an opportunity to kind of share some views with you and discuss some of the complexities which might arise if we think about this as a potential framework for solidarity and what some of the advantages and disadvantages of that might be. So if we take a step back and we think about feminist sisterhood and international female solidarity, we can start by defining solidarity, as Weil does, as being underpinned by the feeling of sympathy and of responsibility for others. And obviously solidarity is key to civil society responses to the refugee crisis, in inverted commas, as it's currently being experienced in the West. And as is being represented not just by civil society but also by many politicians around the world. So we see that Wilde reminds us that solidarity has subjective and emotional elements, and based on these feelings, solidarity movements often offer moral support but also humanitarian assistance. They also engage in political engagement and lobbying, etc., in addition to financing and implementing humanitarian projects in refugee camps and elsewhere around the global south. So solidarity is often viewed through the framework of fraternity, but it's also, I argue, based on notions of sorority and of sisterhood, and this is clearly central to feminist thought and feminist action. However, that focus on sorority and sisterhood often hide the imbalanced relations or the imbalanced power dynamics which often underlie so-called solidary relations. So rather than solidarity being offered between equals, I see that there's a clear frequency for a clear imbalance between those who provide solidarity and those who are conceptualized as its recipients. And this is especially the case in refugee contexts, where, as Barbara Harrell-Bond reminds us, refugees are often expected to conform to the values of their sponsors. And at times, these processes or these kind of exchanges can be characterized as being founded upon paternalism, and Judith Butler uses the terms exclusionary and coercive to define the foundations of many solidarity movements. So this therefore pushes us to consider the extent to which solidarity-led responses to refugees across different spaces might risk reproducing processes of marginalization and discrimination, rather than solely attempting to remedy them. And it pushes us, I hope, to critically reflect on the politics of our solidarity with refugees and to be critically aware of the unequal power relations which refugees negotiate during their interactions and encounters with different actors, including members of European civil society, but also with other refugee groups during their journeys. And we see that there are many analysts who have documented the ways in which multiple forms of dependence on externally provided aid and support have directly impacted the ways in which recipients of solidarity represent or market themselves. So the frameworks that humanitarian aid providers work with often frame the responses that refugees develop in order to market themselves, to secure the ongoing support, whether that's material or political, from different actors. And that solidarity groups often differentiate between groups which are or are not worthy of assistance and support. And this means that many recipients of assistance have to market themselves through political discourses or through different tools available to them to negotiate very complex, broader political situations. And this influences the particular identity which is presented by social and political movements, but also, I argue, by refugees. And it is indeed within this framework and within the broader context of Islamophobia, the securitization of Muslim identities, etc., which are increasingly prevalent but are also long-standing, if we think about it in broader historical terms, we can see that many refugees have felt the need or have identified the potential benefits of constructing particular representational strategies to secure and maintain European solidarity, often feminist solidarity, and also as a means of securing legal status and ongoing support in Europe. So when I'm thinking about the notion of refugee feminism as a potential framework, I'm both considering the relationship between Western civil society actors and refugees, but I'm also potentially thinking about the notion of solidarity between refugees and how this might or might not play out in contexts of limited refugee status opportunities being available and limited resources also being available from different humanitarian actors. So within that broader context of Islamophobia and migrant phobia, there has been a long-standing agenda of research, especially from the 2000s onward, demonstrating that the British anti-terrorism measures, for example, have unequally affected Muslim asylum seekers and refugees in the UK. And we see that Muslim asylum seekers and refugees' identities in the UK have been transformed by the public imagination, compounding the notions of bogus asylum seekers and the questions of genuine refugees, worthy refugees, etc., with a concomitant and at times primal concern with their Muslim identity, which is either identified as being threatening or as a concern or a problem which has to be fixed in a secular setting. And this is because, if we go back to Leila Bourlough's question, do Muslim women really need saving in the context of the representation of Muslim women's vulnerability as a justification for the intervention in Afghanistan, we see that for many people in the West, the answer continues to be yes. There continues to be an assumption, as guided by Elizabeth Ferris, that religion is often perceived to be conservative, steeped in tradition, and invariably resisting change. While modern secular values are invariably presented as espousing gender equality, religion is assumed to confine women to traditional roles. And that's a quotation from Elizabeth Ferris's 2011 piece in the Journal of Refugee Studies. So refugees are simultaneously affected by and framed through these spectres and through these understandings of religious identity, of gender equality as related to religion, etc. But refugees are not merely spectators or vulnerable victims awaiting saviour. Rather, following Boal, we can recognise that refugees are spectators. So they simultaneously observe the realities, but they also act and respond to these. They resist, negotiate, and enact a diverse range of discourses and counter-discourses, embodying different processes of individual and collective transformation. So on the one hand, there are numerous examples of refugee solidarity, such as the work that I've been doing on Palestinian refugees hosting refugees from Syria, whether they are Syrian refugees, Palestinians, Kurds, Iraqis who were formerly based in Syria, etc., but also across the global south. There are numerous examples of this notion of, or this form of refugee humanitarianism. But it's also important not to idealise social relations in these contexts, but also to realise that there are forms of refugee othering. And there are different hierarchies of worth which arise between different representational strategies between different refugee groups. And that's what I'm going to focus on now, just to challenge us to think about the implications of feminist solidarity movements and of the global good governance rhetoric which prioritises the notion of gender equality and female sisterhood in many regards, and some of the paradoxical effects that might have on refugee social dynamics and different forms of epistemic violence, which is what I'm going to be suggesting. So it's against that backdrop that the Sahrawi refugees, who have been the focus of a great deal of my research, have successfully represented themselves as the ideal refugees. And the Sahrawi refugees have been living in refugee camps in southwest Algeria since the 1970s. They are the second longest running caseload supervised by the UNHCR. And they are entirely dependent upon externally provided assistance, and yet they are denominated as ideal in nature by actors such as the UNHCR, the World Food Programme, and other northern humanitarian actors, precisely because of their self-management of the refugee camps, their self-distribution of assistance, and the notion of democracy and gender equality existing within the camps. But the element that I'm interested in exploring here is the extent to which this notion of the ideal refugee is developed precisely through a comparison with other Arab and Muslim women. And I find this a problematic strategy, but one which is intimately related with feminist solidarity movements from the West. And that's what I want us to just think about, hopefully. So the representation of Sahrawi women as powerful, empowered, active individuals immediately opposes the more frequently asserted or reproduced image of refugee women as helpless victims of war and forced displacement, as discussed, for example, by Lisa Malky. Their representation is reproduced by academics, by NGOs, by journalists, etc., who visited the camps, in which Sahrawi women emerge as omnipresent, primordial, not as victims, but rather as empowered, liberated, and active agents who, to a large extent, appear to overshadow their male counterparts in the camps. And such accounts do reflect Sahrawi women's political, managerial, and professional roles in these refugee camp situations. And these are some of the quotations which have been offered by the World Food Programme, but also by Oxfam's representative who visited the camps for under a week in the 1980s and made a quite remarkable declaration that the Sahrawi society, as he viewed it in the refugee camps in the 1980s, was the most fundamentally balanced society he had ever come across in terms of the relationship between men and women. And with organisations such as the WFP using the term matriarchal or the notion of total empowerment to describe conditions in the camp, this should hopefully be raising some flags as to how the international community conceptualises gender relations, how it can conceptualise the existence of a matriarchal society in any context, let alone in a refugee situation in which violence exists across all different planes of social existence, etc. But what I'm interested in is this relationship between the representation of the camps and international actors. And the representation of the camps is particularly attractive or particularly noteworthy because it seems to be unexpected when compared with what we consider refugee camps to look like, what we consider to be the generic norm of what a refugee camp is. So they seem to be the antithesis of what refugee camps are meant to look like. They're democratic, secular, female empowering spaces which are entirely safe for women. We could see this potentially as a corrective to the homogenization and the essentialist representations of refugee women as eternal victims, but it raises questions about the sustainability of such representations and indeed some of those more problematic elements which emerge in processes of representation, as I call them, whereby some social characteristics are highlighted and others are repressed or hidden from view for various reasons. Now, I argue that the notion of Sahrawi women as empowered and secular women has been discursively mobilized by the Sahrawi's political leadership, the Polisario, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, to create what we can call bright bonds following Alba between Sahrawis and their Western observers. There's a connection being created through the terminology and the discourses which are used in the camps. And this is achieved both by accentuating commonalities and a shared sense of feminist sisterhood between secular Sahrawi women and their Western counterparts, and through a purposeful recreation of Arab Muslim women as the Sahrawis and the Spaniards' common other. And the Sahrawi really differentiate themselves from all other Muslim and Arab women, often conflating the two, distancing the Sahrawi self from Islam as a means of securing ongoing material assistance, political support, and solidarity from various Western actors. And despite the significance of Islamic belief and practice to refugees' everyday lives in the camps, the Sahrawi camps have habitually been heralded by European and North American observers as ideal spaces precisely through this notion of secularism, which is equated with or seen as the foundation for this notion of gender equality. And just to include some quotations from the Sahrawi's political leadership that represent this depiction of uniqueness and complete separation from other Muslim and Arab spaces and people. So this is the Sahrawi representative to Damascus who I interviewed in Syria in 2006. And he starts very much by reproducing the Middle East as a space characterized by abuse, whilst the Sahrawi camps and the Sahrawi women are presented as being free from these forms of violence, etc. So the assertion is that Sahrawi camps and Sahrawi women are unique, but it also perpetuates and reproduces this notion of the Middle East as in a space characterized by, imbued with violence, in which Middle Eastern women are constantly perpetually seen as eternal victims of violence. The then Sahrawi Minister of Culture, Mariam Saleh, was interviewed by a Mexican newspaper and even went as far as to say that she sometimes asked herself if Arab women exist. She argued that in the Arab world, the form of feminism which has developed until now lacks depth. There is nothing serious. If they want to recognize us, if they want to recognize our political cause, the Sahrawi cause, they would have to admit that what we have achieved is a treasure. Una joya is the word that they use in the Spanish article. So these are representative of a variety of political discourses, of political statements which are made by representatives of the Sahrawi, but are also echoed in interviews with the youth that I interviewed who have left the Sahrawi camps to study in a variety of locations around the world. So the individuals, the Sahrawi refugees who I interviewed in Cuba, in Syria, in South Africa, in Spain, in addition to Algeria, reproduce similar notions of the uniqueness of the Sahrawi self through this distinction with other women, and through other Arab women in particular. And what I ask myself in this context is, well, what can feminism actually mean in a situation where there is this othering of other women, where there is a hierarchy being constructed of the worth and the gender equality that might exist in one space but not in another, etc. And it leads us again to think about, well, this notion of feminist sisterhood and international female solidarity, which we see as being based on supposedly women's common experiences of oppression and exploitation. And the equation between sisters and feminism has reached, for example, the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines a sister as a fellow woman seen in relation to feminist issues. And in this context, we could see that Sahrawi officials, when they claim sisterhood and overarching commonality with Western actors, it's seen as a way of securing support for the self-determination of women on an individual level, but also for Sahrawi women on a collective level in an attempt to secure self-determination for the Western Sahara. And the notion of sorority, sororidad, was explicitly invoked by the head of the National Union of Sahrawi Women, Fatma Mehdi, in numerous occasions, but also in the 2007 National Union of Sahrawi Women Conference in 2007, which is illustrated here in this photograph. Just as similar claims have been made throughout encounters with Western observers to the camps on numerous occasions. So when she was celebrating the arrival of a group of Swedish socialist women in the camps for this conference, she declared that these Swedish women had come to exchange ideas with their socialist sisters, i.e. the Sahrawi, and to manifest their solidarity and their support for Sahrawi women's struggle for freedom and independence. Fatma continued by reflecting that the conference would provide Sahrawi women with an opportunity to, and I quote, familiarise themselves with the experiences and struggles of their non-Sahrawi sisters around the world. And elsewhere she's declared, for example, that despite social, cultural and political differences, the feminist cause is the same in any corner of the world. So we could argue that broader claims, broader assertions of common gendered interests and goals simultaneously create ties with Western women's groups, whilst or by reflecting the importance assigned by the new development agenda to what Candiotto refers to as the mantras of gender mainstreaming and gender equality. And by pinpointing claims to sisterhood and a commonality of feminist values during their interaction with Western audiences, the Polisario and the Women's Union representatives recreate Sahrawi women according to Western preferences in many different ways. And yet sisterhood can also be understood in other ways. For example, with reference to the notion of a feminized ummah and the notion of Arab women as sisters as well in that sense. But while the notion of sisterhood could evoke ideas of empathy, connectedness and respect, the use of the term sisters in other contexts in this discourse actually evoke different connotations. So the former permanent representative to the UN, Esweich, wrote that Sahrawi women's position is clearly different from the position of their sisters in the rest of the Arab and Muslim world. And although the Sahrawi and other Arab women do in fact share a set of religious beliefs, practices and a language, for example, the official distancing from the Arab and Muslim sisters is increasingly prevalent in non-Sahrawi areas, with, as I said earlier, Mariam Saleh even going as far as to tell the international audience that she sometimes asks herself if Arab women actually even exist. And I propose that the official distanciation from their Muslim sisters may in part be possible due to the utilisation of this concept of sisterhood. by associating themselves with this concept, Sahrawi women and men can be seen to be demonstrating to the Western audience their authority to criticise and reflect on and reject the fate of Muslim refugee women or Muslim Arab women, even in the light, to quote Edward Said, of an absence of substantiated supporting arguments or modulating qualifications. So in this context, the term sister is precisely used to validate an argument presented by a group who knows what is inside of that matter, but which prefers to occupy the outside of that position. And this is very evident in the case of the Sahrawi discourse, which is very comparative in nature. And the conceptualization of the Sahrawi sister is the sister with the Spanish, whereas the Arab Muslim woman can constitute the position of the other for both the Sahrawi and the Spanish in this way. There's a bright bond between Spanish and Sahrawi sisters, and there is an official distanciation from Muslim or Arab sisters in that same term. Now, this isn't unequivocally represented. There are alternative frameworks of representation and interaction. So there are exchanges between Palestinian and Sahrawi women and Sahrawi and Palestinian youth, for example. And there are critiques presented by other Sahrawi refugees, including Wuruda Sahra, who in one of her blogs laments the representational strategies that the National Union of Sahrawi Women has represented. And she argues that the image which has been presented by the National Union of Sahrawi Women is an image which our friends in the West are so enchanted by. That's a quotation from Wurud. So she highlights that the range of images which are presented and projected by Sahrawi politicians are specifically used to maintain the attention, the support, the solidarity of Western actors. And this discursive construction is a misrepresentation of Sahrawi women because it does not reflect the reality of their lives. And distancing the Sahrawi self, the refugee self, from Islam and asserting the Sahrawi self as empowered and gender equal is indeed very understandable in many different regards. I argue that this is part of the politics of survival, which does actually ensure a continuity of humanitarian aid and of political assistance, which keeps the agenda, keeps their struggle on the international agenda. But it's also misrepresentation. And in many ways, you could see that it's a form of violence, since it positions Sahrawi refugees as having to forcibly distance themselves from something which is very important to them on an everyday level. And this is, there are many other studies which argue that refugees being forced to present themselves as not being associated with Islam or of being critical of Islam for different reasons has serious serious effects on different levels. So Susan Akram, for example, looks at the neo-Orientalist structures which underpin many refugee advocates' work for refugees in refugee status determination processes, in which women are encouraged to silence the reality of their religious belief and identity, the significance of religious practice on individual and communal levels, in the hope, refugee advocates often hold, that this will secure legal status for them. So this strategy of representing the Middle East as oppressive of women, as inhabited by eternal victims of violence, etc., is justified on the basis of ensuring that there is a provision of support, a provision of status, a provision of solidarity for these women. But distancing the self and the refugee other, depicting the refugee other as the eternal victim of violence in order to assert one's own positional superiority, to gain assistance, to gain political solidarity, etc., is understandable, as is any strategy designed to secure refugee status. But we can argue that there are also both forms of epistemic violence against both the self and the other. And my aim in critiquing this notion is not to criticise the Sahrawi refugees, although I do believe that there has to be a space to critique certainly political representations of refugee situations in this regard, because these are strategies which are developed to negotiate highly complex, unequal systems which are violent against refugees in many different ways. But rather what I want to do is just ask that question, and to leave this hopefully as a question for discussion, of how we can ensure that refugees are not pushed to represent themselves in ways that lead to forms of epistemic violence against themselves and against others. How we can develop forms of solidarity, and in particular feminist-inspired solidarity, between refugees, which do not reproduce systems of othering, exclusion and silencing. So, thank you.